This week we are talking about Brics, and by now you would have seen all the major headlines. Essentially, the influence of the growing member states, if you look at the Brics cluster, the GDP contribution and the portion of population that the Brics cluster has in terms of its oversight, and ultimately what it looks like in terms of not only the future of Brics, but the immediate impact of how they coordinate policy, legal factors, and ultimately create a Brics that can be sufficient and effective. We tackle all those headlines, but more importantly, we spend time on what it really means for entrepreneurs and enterprises and capital allocators that are dealing in these markets. Joining us is two great panelists giving their views on the ground of what it really means and giving you some insights of what it ultimately would take to flourish and to leverage the opportunities that something like the Brics cluster can afford. So joining me for this conversation will be MD Ramesh. He's the CEO of Improved Foods out of Rwanda. He brings over 30 years of business experience in agriculture and agri-food business across the continent. I really valued his view on how you operationalize a business across Africa, but more importantly, how would it look like in a Brics context where India becomes such a critical trading partner for Africa and the Middle East? His knowledge was immense, and you will really gain how important it would be to really understand the underlying dynamics of leveraging opportunities on the back of the Brics trade agreements. Also joining us was Johan Burger. I see Johan as the polymath for all things Africa. He spends a lot of his time in research as he is part of the executive education faculty at the College of Business and Economics for the University of the UAE, but also his understanding of global economics as he spent time in Singapore and Middle East and also in Africa gives you a very broad view of what are the dynamics at play, especially when it comes to the political landscape and how that political landscape ultimately drives the economic field and how that economic side has bearing on social dynamics. Between Ramesh and Johan, they bring immense experience around these different member states and the knowledge of these markets. They give you a unique view on how entrepreneurs, enterprises, capital allocators, and these markets engage, maybe with government or also private sector. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. We cover a lot of ground between the relationships of these member states, but ultimately, I guess the big takeaway is that you will get an on-the-ground view of what it means for private sector and government trading in these economies. On a closing note, a big thank you for both Ramesh and Johan for their time and all their insights. And also the association that South African Business Council has with the United Arab Emirates University. We thank you for the support and the partnerships, and we look forward to continuing these conversations as we see more opportunities for entrepreneurs operating across the African continent and also engaging in the Middle East markets. Okay, gentlemen, a warm welcome to Ramesh and also Johan. And obviously today we are talking about Brics. And it's almost been a month since the summit, the 15th edition of it. And the big news was obviously how there's been more expanding members coming to the fold of the Brics bloc. So I thought maybe to set the scene and give you a bit of backdrop, I'm going to give you just some data points. And then maybe we can use these data points to go a bit further into of what it really means. So when we talk about Brics, it's probably important to have these two key data points that is really the backdrop in terms of how the macro environment associated with Brics is influencing the micro environment and how the short term will ultimately impact the long term. Now, if you start with Brics, let's roll it back to 1995. The Brics countries, their global contribution to GDP in PPP terms was around 17%. Come to current state of 2023, the Brics countries increased that contribution to 32%. And if you look at the expanded Brics in 2024, the 11 members, that will be up to 45% of global GDP contribution.
Correlate that to G7. 1995, we were at its all-time high. We had around 45%. And then the G7 today contributes about 30% of global GDP. So that's quite a key factor, just thinking about the macro environment. If we look at demographics, another data point to think about is just the population. Brics today contributes about 42% of global population, bring it up to 3.2 billion people. Expanded Brics will take that number to 46%, which really at real terms around 3.7 billion. In correlation to the G7 sits at about 10% and makes up around 775 million people. If you look at the nuances there, I guess the other big component is just the demography dynamics in terms of a younger population versus a older population, and how that translates into productivity of that workforce. The BRICS, if you think about India, South Africa, and some of those other key geographies that's in that block, they have a far younger generation of population that still can produce a lot of productivity versus the olding or aging population of the G7. Another key factor would be the trading routes. So by looking at the expanded BRICS bloc, you now have access to significant trading routes across the globe. Traditionally, Persian Gulf and Red Sea and Suez Canal were all critical in global trade. But now with this type of agreement and coordination between the expanded BRICS, now it suddenly starts opening up international trade in terms of the North and South corridor, but also the Belt and Road Initiative, which really unlocks the East and West corridors as well. Notwithstanding that over time, the Arctic Sea route in terms of Europe-Asia is also becoming a key component that can potentially be an economic trade route in the future. So it begs the question, the expanded BRICS really has key fundamentals that could be positive economic factors as a backdrop to how this BRICS cluster work together today, but also in the future. The expanded BRICS, they make up 54% of global oil production in the world today. The G7 doesn't even come close to that, even though the US is the global leader when it comes to oil production. In terms of food, the BRICS countries make up 5 of the world's largest food producers globally. And if you look at between China, Brazil, India, Argentina, and Russia, those are the major ones, obviously the US being the 6th. And we spoke about the demographic components and how population growth is a key factor across BRICS, notwithstanding the fact that South Africa and India have growing populations and younger populations. And the final point there would be the landmass. Between the landmass in terms of geography, these BRICS clusters make up 30% of the global landmass, making it a key strategic factor, not only in trading routes, but in terms of also production and productivity that can continue in these components. So it will be good to get your views. And maybe we start with you, Johan, just in terms of your general perception. I mean, you've been on the ground, you deal a lot with Africa. What is your unique view in terms of what you see?
Right. BRICS, what is the benefit thereof, and how the greater size? I think from an enlarged market, it is undoubtedly so that you're sitting with a scale that is huge. If we had a trade bloc, which BRICS is not. So BRICS needs to look at how do we convert what we currently have, this huge population grouping, this huge GDP, how do we convert that into a trade bloc that is mutually beneficial to the respective parties? So that for me is the immediate point of departure. One cannot deny that. However, if one has a look at what BRICS has been doing until now on an economic basis and a multilateral basis, not a lot. Most of the activity of BRICS has been happening at a bilateral basis, with China investing all over the place, the same going for India, Brazil reaching out, South Africa is a bit small there, and we can get to the other parties now, the new players. But we're not seeing a lot of trade on as a grouping, as a Brics grouping. What is undoubtedly so also is the fact that we're sitting now with an entity that from an influence perspective is gaining huge strides, making huge strides, which can be good news and be bad news depending on how you look at it and how it plays out. You have on the one hand a China and a Russia, and I would think an Iran in the new one, looking at being anti-Western, whereas you're sitting with specifically the three players in MENA, Egypt, UAE, and Saudi, together with Brazil, not too keen on alienating the West, but still doing their utmost as being the mouthpiece of the global South. Brics being seen as an alternative, a replacement of the non-aligned movement of the 1960s. So there are various elements that you need to look at and take into consideration. But globally speaking, an exciting development, I think, with the huge market, should it get to execution.
Yeah, and I guess the thing is, just you mentioned there, some of it is regarding the non-alignment that we saw in the 1970s and how that translates. And the other big thing is, you mentioned that there's also some vulnerability in terms of how we find coordination between these different countries. Partly, it would seem if you listen to the West and you try to get their views and correlate that back to some of the commentators, especially in the Brics, it seems like it's a very alternative motion to sanctions. It's almost to see how the trading bloc or potential trading bloc can be a key alternative to sanctions, and almost buffer some of the weaponization that we've seen from the US in terms of their trade policy.
Indeed. As a matter of fact, you would see a couple of commentators actually making that point, is that the sanctions against, amongst others, Russia now, and also against Iran, has given impetus to the formation and the eagerness, the willingness to become members of Brics. Just to give you an indication, apparently 22 people formally applied to be members, whereas another 22 said they would like to be as well, indicated an eagerness, a willingness to become members. This shows you that the world is not so keen on looking at a unipolar system, with the US specifically calling the shots. And that they're not even all that keen on a bipolar system, but literally looking at, we want a multipolar system where we can reach out and participate in areas that we want to, without running the danger of alienating a party that can cut off your water and lights. Africa, for instance, speaks, or rather is quite concerned about alienating, on the one hand, the US, and on the other hand, the China. It needs both, but it needs to tread so carefully as to not, endanger its own trade. South Africa recently had the huge problem of maybe getting or losing its membership of AGOA because of reaching out to or not being seen against Russia, for example, and reaching out to others such as China, etc. So, yes, you are looking at an entity, a world where the players are looking at. We don't want to be beholden to one entity such as the US.
So Ramesh, I mean, what's your take? You obviously run big business across a lot of these geographies. You engage with them in multiple ways. You employ people, you create products, you distribute across these geographies. What's your sense? What does this mean?
Right. So thank you very much. I think Johan has laid out the political background quite nicely, and that gives a a good tapestry to work with. If I paint the commercial picture, I think where Africa is stuck. So the background of everything that Johan said, I think is very clear to all of us. If I talk to the politicians and senior business leaders, policymakers in Africa, they are torn between being politically aligned to the West, but being commercially aligned to the East. Okay, I'm using East very loosely. I mean the Southern Bloc. And they do understand that commercially the Southern Bloc does not give money for free, which the West does. Okay, they like the idea of the free money, but I think most policymakers now understand and realize that free money is not going to get us too far. Okay, there are too many levers attached to the free money, which is not really free. Okay, number one. Number two, they have, on the other hand, seen the commercial exploitation that the Chinese have come here over the last 15 years and done. And they also realize that those levers need to be seriously trimmed or managed. Otherwise, that Chinese money is not good. What they do recognize is that the late entrants, which are Saudi, Brazil, India, and UAE, all part of the Brics now, do not give free money. And they come here with very clear, hard-headed commercial calls on what they can do and what they cannot do. All right. So I think the Africans are also happy to recognize and realize that the phase of development that the Brics nations are at probably suits their need far better than the very removed West. The mistake, in my view, in West Africa still is that they are very West aligned. Okay, I mean, take Nigeria, for example. Beyond the UK and the US, they see nothing else. While the East is getting far, far, far more amenable to and open to Asian ideas like Singapore and Vietnam and Malaysia and Thailand and India, etc., etc. Okay, I think that is where the split in Africa is right now. I do believe that one of the big aspects that the BRICS alignment to Africa, or the African alignment to BRICS, can bring is the fact that Africa will remain a food importing country for a long time. The important point that you made, that a significant part of the world's food production happens in these BRIC countries, is going to be valuable. All right. Similarly, there are BRIC countries that are searching for food security, like Saudi Arabia is, like UAE is, and some part of China also is looking for that. And Africa can surely become one of those locations from where this food security can be achieved. I believe that if the Africans use the BRICS association cleverly, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, there is a lot of scope for them to get help, support, advice, and I think some kind of guarantees. One, for the money; two, for technology; three, for understanding development and hastening their own development. Most importantly, partnerships that can add significant value to them. So my view is that this is a far better association where the Africans have some say than any association they've had with the West, where it was only free money that bought their association. Lastly, I'd like to say that unlike the free money that the West got them and the, in my view, punitive investment that the Chinese put in, the Africans will have to learn to regulate their association with any of these BRIC countries, bilaterally or multilaterally, far better than they've done so far. That truly will pave the pathway for A, long-term relationships, and B, beneficial relationships for the Africans. Otherwise, I think they've always got shortchanged because they didn't know what they were negotiating themselves into.
Yeah, and the big thing is also, it seems like it's actually less about the G7. It's less about competing with other traditional trading blocs. It seems the story is more about how do we unlock potential for these growth markets, but do it in such a way that it can actually sustain good business over time. And I guess you can see that in these leading indicators. The signal is trade flows are going to be important, food production, energy production. These are key commodities that govern global trade. And, for me, you almost need to be careful about reading too much between the lines, but the trade-off for the West is predominantly influence. Were these things to come to halt? You mentioned some of the capital flows, especially how money flows into the BRICS countries. And, this is the other thing that started slow and hopefully will pick up, is with the new development bank, which is really capitalized by Chinese money. The last 5 years, they did about 33 billion and earmarked that for about 100 projects. But what's your view in terms of those projects really impacting the day-to-day lives in these BRICS countries? Because, for us that ultimately live in these countries and trade in these countries, I guess that's the big question. Will the money flow to initiatives and programs that can actually unlock value?
So that's an excellent question. And frankly, that is where we should all be headed towards. My view is that in the past, and Johan and I have spoken about this separately, in the past, a lot of the Chinese projects that were assigned to Africa ended up with the Africans compromising far more than they should have in the lure of what seemed like a good deal. All right, because nobody read the contract, or the Chinese managed the contract readers in a manner that they got contaminated. Now, whether it's coming through the shape of a developmental bank or it's coming through directly from Chinese funding, I think the Africans have to be extra careful about the quality of the contract they read. In my view, the Brazilians and the Chinese are equally competitive as far as construction, logistics, infrastructure are concerned. Okay, and there is enough example of the Brazilians having done some good projects on the continent. And I think the Africans should always approach a Chinese approach or an Indian approach or a Brazilian approach, which may be bilateral, by viewing the possible options that they have, so that any such offer from a Chinese or the Indians or the Brazilians, who are the three big ones who will probably come around with these kind of offers, are aware that there are options to them, and the Chinese and the Africans are not getting pressed into a contract. My view is that a lot has happened on the continent already where the Africans have got compromised. So my summarized view is that there is immense potential for those developmental projects to do good for Africa. But as long as the Africans read the contract and keep options in their back pocket, it can work.
Yeah, I think Africa finds itself frequently in a position where they think they have to choose between who's going to help us. On the one hand, you have the US. Ramesh referred to China, Brazil, and India. And now you've got also the two of the richest elements in the BRICS is Saudi and the UAE, both reaching out into Africa, with the biggest one there being the UAE, who is currently fourth or the fifth largest FDI investor in Africa. And has been reaching out with DP World, with Carrefour, with Dubai.com, with Masdar, in various areas of infrastructure, be it transport, being renewable energy, being e-commerce. If one goes one step back and you look at, for example, the struggle that you've seen not only between the East or then the South, global South, and the West in the form of the US, but when you look at the competition between China and India, China came up with its BRI, and every newspaper, whatever, publication you read for quite a long while was about the BRI. And every country in Africa wanted to jump on the bandwagon, and not only Africa, in ASEAN, in Asia, and even Europe and North Africa were keen to get on this. India came forward initially. Just thereafter, I can recall 2016, 2017, more or less in that period, with the AAGC, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, that it brought on board Japan to act as an alternative. And they said, we give free choice, and it's about the respect of the sovereignty of the countries. But basically, we want to be an alternative at a multilateral level, because it was also keen in Africa. Very recently, it has come up with IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, again as an alternative to China's BRI and the whole process of China's going forth. So you have this competition about then, what you call it, three groupings, and don't forget Russia, and don't forget Turkey. They are all going into Africa and trying to gain influence through investment projects, through infrastructure, because make no mistake, Africa has a dire need. The African Development Bank has said by 2025, they will need 170 billion per annum, of which there's a $100 billion gap in terms of financing. It needs to come from somewhere. Seemingly, China has burnt its fingers with some African countries. They're not going to get their money back. So you need to put that in the greater picture as well to see, in terms of investment, in terms of money flows, there's a huge need in Africa. And whereas you're sitting with an Egypt and an Ethiopia that are now two new members of BRICS, they are in dire need of capital for their own investment projects, as is South Africa, as is Argentina. Argentina is sitting with triple-digit inflation. And one wonders why they are part of the new BRICS, given all the potential choices that there could have been, just to enrich the pot a bit.
But don't you think also, Johan, that some of these countries are playing almost like a double game? I'm just thinking top of mind India, which are, they need to be close to the US as well. So you're seeing a lot of political leverage between India and the US. And you mentioned some of the grievances between other BRICS countries that India potentially could have. I mean, how do these BRICS ultimately reconcile some of these political differences? I mean, does this not talk to the fact that the members as part of the BRICS bloc is almost from an ethical and from a governance point of view very, very different, and actually very diverse in terms of what the objectives are?
Well, I think we must remember that governments, states do not have friends, they have interests. And today, what works for me might not work tomorrow. So I do what I need to do, and realpolitik plays a role. India has a problem with China as far as its borders, with taking into consideration the Himalayas. It has a problem with China, given the fact that China has strong relationships with Pakistan, with whom India obviously is not all that keen with. And so one can go on. I've mentioned these alternative arrangements from India. It is a question of dealing with these issues as and when they happen based on that. India does have strong relations with the West, and that's one of the challenges that I have with China on the one hand, and Russia and Iran on the other hand. Now, those three are very anti-Western, whereas India is not. As a matter of fact, I've read some commentators that said initially, in terms of expansion, China, Russia, and the two of them and Brazil were very keen to increase the numbers of BRICS, whereas India was concerned that a larger grouping would become a mouthpiece for anti-Western, anti-imperialism. Okay, that is not too bad, but anti-Western, propaganda, with China taking the lead there. Eventually, that is going to be the big problem. How do you reconcile these different elements, these different ideologies, these different points of view at an ideological level? That is going to be the test of success eventually for a BRICS.
Paul, I have a view on this. Not entirely different from what Johan said, but I think I'll add a few things to that. One is that I think we must all remember that the India of today, the China of today, maybe even the Brazil of today, is very different from the Brazil or all these countries 1 decade back. Their self-confidence, their understanding of themselves, their belief in their capabilities, and their very clear understanding of what position they occupy in the world hierarchy is very different from 10 years back. When they negotiate with the US and the UK today, they are now negotiating as equals. And I use the word very carefully, equals. Okay? India knows when it sits on the table that the US wants it as badly as they want some support from the US, most likely in the Security Council. Okay? India wants a seat on the Security Council. That's one of the big bargaining chips the US is using against them. Okay? Because if India sits on the Security Council, it can neutralize China anytime it wants. And it needs to get there. All right? And one of the drivers of its economic power is also that. Brazil doesn't care so much about the Security Council. Brazil really is probably in the phase that India was 10 years back, wants to really accelerate its economy, create employment, become a good country, etc., etc. Okay. And one of the reasons Brazil is in the BRICS is in the belief that it can expand its commercial empire and therefore grow richer. Okay. While India is in the BRICS because it wants to show the rest of the world that we are now an equal with the rest of you, and it needs some backing. And Russia and China, to that extent, are a good enough backing for them to take on the West. They will not ever, that's not the Indian mentality. They will always sit on the fence. They will never take a chance. And like Johan said, they will only back their own need. They will never take sides. But it's not a bad bargaining chip to have Russia and China on your back when you're talking to the West. Because the West know that if they switch the other side, they have a problem in Asia then. Because the entire Asia has lost out apart from Japan. And Japan, as you know, is very neutral on most of these matters. So strategically, I think bulk of these BRIC players are playing the card that we want to be seen as equals.
Yeah,
I'd like to add to that, Paul. Sorry.
No, go for
If
it.
you look also in terms of the MENA countries, I'm looking at taking sides or having a specific perspective. Make no mistake, Iran is going to be very anti-West, anti-US. Now, this new enlarged BRICS, the US has one of two ways of looking at it. It can see it as a threat, or it can see it as an Egypt, UAE, and a Saudi tempering the anti-West rhetoric and even building a bridge into the global south, which the US can tap into if they view this as an opportunity and not necessarily as a threat. So you have this opportunity as well.
Oh, clever.
Yeah,
that's true.
That opportunity, will survive and flourish if there is like policy coordination and again, when these different trading blocks can actually reconcile some of their key differences. And I guess the one thing you mentioned there is the Middle East. The Middle East has done this before, right? If you look at the GCC and how the GCC is actually flourishing, there's already blueprints for this. So the big elephant in the room, I guess, is Iran, and then also the relevance of some of these African countries, especially in North Africa. So, Johan, I mean, what's your view around, especially Saudi? Because Saudi traditionally had a security relationship with the US. We know in the Middle East that the US sees potentially in the long run their security involvement as a lesser of a factor. So, Saudi obviously needs to start also diversifying and de-risking that sense, and then also start trading with the likes of Egypt and the rest of Africa. So how do you see that relationship in the future?
I very much doubt whether Egypt, UAE, Saudi will let go of their security relationship with the US. It's not, the strength of the relationship is not what it was a couple of years ago. It will stay in there for quite a while going in the future. It's not a short-term demise. What you now have is China has brokered relations between Iran and Saudi. And there's also a rapprochement between UAE and Iran. As long as this peace holds, or this good relationship that has now been brokered and which China sees as a feather in its cap, as long as that holds, the Middle East component will be a sound player within the greater BRICS, and actually could lead to more Middle East countries being brought on board. The question that I have, why is Turkey not there? Why bring on board Iran, and why not Turkey, which is a much more influential player in the Middle East and in Africa? Make no mistake, Iran is also reaching out into Africa, but Turkey is there to a much greater extent, first of all, and in the Middle East, it has much greater influence, and it is a member of NATO. So I would have said bring them on board. But now you have a UAE and Saudi on the one hand, and you have Iran on the other hand. And this relationship would need to be nurtured. You're sitting with the big brother China. Both Saudi and UAE have reached out. Basically, what they are telling the US is that we can choose with whom we want to be friends. Do not see this as a negative towards you. We like you, but we like them too. And basically, there's not a lot that US can do about that currently.
I have a thought here, Paul. Actually, what Johan said in the very end is it rings a big bell for me. My view is that the inclusion of Iran is a statement. BRICS is just letting the world know that we will do it exactly the way we want to do it and will not be governed by any of your choices. Okay, it's a statement. I completely agree that Turkey it makes for a good potential target, but I'm just wondering if Turkey has the courage to sign up to the BRICS. One, because of NATO. Two, because of its somewhat shaky relationship in the EU. And it desperately needs as much support and links as it can get. So I'm not sure if Turkey would have been willing to take the plunge. But having said that, we must all remember that a significant part of the Iranian commercialization in its years of hibernation in the last 8-10 years has been via the UAE. And I'm sure, Johan, you're aware of how much of the dirham trade was happening out of Iran, meant for the rest of the world. So it didn't happen in dollars, it happened in dirhams. Some of it came to Africa, many of it went to other parts of the world. So I imagine that UAE and Iran coming in together has some logical sense. Lastly, the amount of inroads that UAE, through its Dubai base for a lot of multinationals and investing companies, has made into Africa, I think it's not adequately appreciated or understood. There is so much more that can be done for sure, but UAE will be an immensely attractive gateway for the BRICS to come into Africa. So I think it'll play a very important role.
Yeah, well, look, there's no doubt. On the Turkey conversation, I would suggest that if you look at the first or at the spectrum of time, over time, you probably will see Turkey coming into the fold of BRICS. But before that, the type of deals that are being structured between the UAE and Turkey, in the first week in September, there was actually an article on these CEPA agreements, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements. And the UAE has earmarked 26 of them for the next 12 months. And Turkey is one of those geographies. So it's going to be interesting as you see some of these BRICS countries or members creating deals for their internal bilateral trade and how that ultimately could potentially roll up and cascade into more trade agreements across the Middle East and Africa region.
I wanted to ask, you're sitting now with Egypt and you're sitting with Ethiopia. Egypt, one can see there are very specific benefits for the BRICS having Egypt on board. I read an article in from India that actually said Ethiopia was not selected initially as a member, and the Wednesday night when at the dinner where the members were announced, Ethiopia heard it was not a member, and it kicked up a fuss. And Ahmed Abish said then, how can Ethiopia, an African country, which is the cradle of mankind, not be a member of BRICS? And then Cyril Ramaphosa went around and brought them on board. Now, my question is, why bring on board an Ethiopia and not a Nigeria? Why is the West Africa shining in its absence? Why don't you have a Kenya, which is in terms of stability, make no mistake, much better than a choice than Ethiopia, because in Ethiopia, you're sitting with a scenario that they are in a constant state of civil war. Let's call it as it is. And then you have Ethiopia and Egypt at loggerheads over the grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And that fight has been coming for the past 10 years. Why that axis, ignoring Kenya, ignoring West Africa? Why is West Africa not on the board? Also North Africa for that matter. Algeria and Morocco are two shining examples of contributions that can be made. Algeria is one of the largest gas exporters in the world, which could be the benefit of energy-wise strengthen the BRICS scenario as it is. Morocco is a shining example of what can be done as far as manufacturing output is concerned and renewable energy, and is the fourth largest economy. Fifth largest, sorry. You're sitting, in any case, going back to Egypt. Egypt has been, for the past couple of years, the first choice or number one ranked investment destination in Africa, in addition to being the second largest economy. Yet we don't have the largest economy when you don't have other potentials like a Ghana, like a Cote d'Ivoire, like a Senegal. Why? And that is what I would like to ask my good friend
Ramesh.
So I have
maybe as a backdrop, tell us what your thoughts around the different mindsets, and as Johan just explained, this dichotomy in terms of the benefits and the trade-offs between these countries.
Right. First is that French Africa is an easy answer. As long as the French influence continues to be with them, it's very unlikely they'll come to the BRICS. Ivory is probably the most successful example of a francophone country that can break away. Okay, and that has a capacity and the commercial strength to do that. Probably, if any country joins the BRICS, it'll be the Ivory Coast, is my view. But I think it'll take some time, right? So that's one part. Nigeria has never had the history of adhering by the rules and regulations of any association it's joined. Their ego does not permit them to subside, to abide by any of the rules and regulations. My view is that they will consider Nigeria a big, unmanageable elephant, however large it is and however important it is. Third thing, don't forget that Nigeria was recently going through its elections. I'm not sure they were canvassing anywhere for any memberships anywhere. All the political leaders are trying to figure out who would be the president. And post-presidency, I don't know how many of you are watching Nigeria, it's a complete outright mess. And Tinubu has opened up cans of worms and cans of snakes that he has no clue how to manage. So I'm not sure they're right now in a mood to be talking to a lot of other parts of the world. They probably missed the bus because of that reason. But if I was sitting in the BRICS, I would have viewed a Nigerian membership with a lot of suspicion. Okay. On the other hand, I would imagine Ethiopia is far more pliable, far more desperate for association. It brings some level of opportunity. More importantly, it's not an oil country. It's a much more diversified opportunity for the BRIC countries to want to consider for investment. They all think that Nigeria is a one-shot oil investment country, and the West has already taken a large part of that. Chinese are also not interested in China, in Nigeria. Do you realize? The Chinese are almost not present in Nigeria, simply because that oil piece has been completely taken away. They don't therefore see any other opportunity there. From that point of view, Ethiopia makes sense with all its difficulties and all its challenges. I'm not sure Kenya is large enough right now to be considered, neither in the size of the economy, nor in the size of the land. And therefore, it doesn't fit their bill. You see, Argentina, South Africa, for all their troubles, are large countries. And that's probably why they tick the box.
Now, I'm unsure on the business case for Ethiopia. I guess I understand that there's a trajectory and could be a large market over time. But, once again, compared to some of the other potential on the continent, and if you long Africa, I mean, surely you would be saying, how do I get more involved in the African continental free trade area? How do I get access to those geographies? So Ethiopia stays an elephant in the room for me in some way. I mean, Johan, what's your sense?
I agree. Algeria has a GDP on a purchasing power parity basis of 621 billion. Ethiopia, 394. Morocco, 388. It doesn't have the size of the economy, the size of the population. Ethiopia is 120 million, but it is far better managed, far better run, far better organization in terms of its economy, etc. Right, Nigeria, my good friend makes a good case there, so I'm not going to go into that further. But in Africa, you have two obvious choices in Algeria and Morocco. As it is, one of the drivers behind the choice of an Ethiopia, according to some analysts, has been Russia and China having a very strong interest in Northern Africa as an entity, and is using Egypt and will be using Egypt as a springboard into the rest of it. The odd man out there is obviously still Libya. Okay, Tunisia is too small. Also very nice place to be in, but in terms of clout, not in the same league as the others. Libya has its own challenges for quite a number of decades or years, let's be nice. It will not be around and available for this kind of exercise. But I totally agree with you. There are obvious other opportunities that could have been looked at instead of Ethiopia. I would have still looked at Nigeria. You're looking at a 200 million person economy. And although you have a lot of poor people, there are a lot of rich people as well. So from a consumer market, not to be denied. And yes, Ramesh makes a good point that from an oil perspective, the West has tapped into that. But there could be a lot more. We spoke about food production. Nigeria has the potential. And I would think twice before negating Nigeria. I agree with Ramesh at this stage of the game. There's a lot of challenges. Bola Tinubu has more problems than he can deal with at this stage of the game. So it's going to take a bit of a while before they can settle down and reach out to this kind of activity.
So that's going to be an interesting dynamic also to see. So let's maybe talk about Africa. So this is a growth story, and ultimately, if all things work well, there'll be better relationships. There would be a market that potentially is a bit more predictable. It's a safer market, and because of these key factors, you should have more capital coming into the continent. You should see more entrepreneurs building businesses. And like we said earlier, there is a great opportunity because there's rapid urbanization on the continent. There's a growing demography as well. A few years ago, we had the African Continental Free Trade Area essentially launching, and that's unlocking more value and potentially a catalyst for a lot of the BRICS conversation as well. How do you both see that panning out? Do you see it as a key contributor? Does it unlock for you more potential and opportunities, especially for the enterprise and the market, the free market that it needs to stimulate in terms of the entrepreneurs and enterprises?
Johan, you want to go first?
Right. Okay. AFCFTA launched formally 1 January 2021. By September last year, not a single trade had taken place. Then the AFCFTA launched the GTI, the Guided Trade Initiative, bringing on board 8 countries specifically nominated and about 90-odd products to get this thing off the ground. Of course, it needs to be seen that there's some level of success. Challenges, infrastructure. Road, rail, ports, airports, energy, water. Another challenge, despite all the best intentions, still non-tariff barriers as well as actually tariff barriers, because make no mistake, tariffs are still a sizable source of revenue, a source of sizable revenue for a lot of the countries. And then you have a lot of political leaders unable of subordinating national interest to regional interest. So the AFCFTA is a much talked about entity with huge potential for Africa, make no mistake, but it has these challenges. Now you're sitting with an entity where you want to grow and develop intra-Africa trade from its current 17, 18% to boost it 40, 50, 60%. It is still easier for Africa to trade with the rest of the world than it is with itself. Now you're sitting with the BRICS members. China is already hugely investing, and we can look at the tens of thousands of road and rail that they've put in place. Russia is in Africa. India is in Africa. The UAE is in Africa with building and managing ports. And so we could go on. So you're sitting on a bilateral basis, members of BRICS already actively involved in Africa. So the question is, what can BRICS as a body, as an entity, do more than what its members on a bilateral basis are currently doing? And that is the big question. And I'm going to pass that to my good friend, Ramesh.
Thank you, Johan. That's a good background. So my view is that as a bloc, they will have to come to some agreement as to in cross investing, cross trading, cross providing services to each other. There'll have to be some engagement that will make the ease of doing business with each other far better than it is today. Like Johan said, because it's bilateral, it's a negotiated discussion on every transaction. That will have to change, number one. My view is that the Africans will benefit a lot if they get into that agreement wherein the BRICS agree on a common phased agreement between these countries. They could also say we have BRIC countries level 1, BRIC countries level 2. And in the level 1, we'll have different rules. In the level 2, we'll have different rules. And from level 1 to level 2, the rules will be different. That's also possible because India may not like to offer Chinese investors as much space in India and vice versa, right? So level 1 may say that within us, we'll have different rules or we'll have bilateral rules. Possible. What Africa should push for is the fact that we will make life easy for the BRIC guys to come over here. Technology, investments, infrastructure, partnerships, processing, all that stuff we'll provide all the easy landscape that they want. But we must be given some preference as to when they choose their targets, which will also mean that then you will see the BRIC pushing for expansion in the membership within Africa, because then they'll start cherry picking 12, 13 important countries that they would want to be in. Okay, right now it's just 3. That will have to change. My view is that the Africans, I don't think, are thinking this through yet because they're all thinking for themselves. And frankly, Ethiopia, Egypt, and South Africa by themselves are reasonably large-sized countries with immense problems of their own. So they're not thinking Pan-Africa right now. So I don't know if there's a Pan-African discussion open here. We can just talk about what is available for Africa. And I think because of what both of you have said earlier about the amount of capabilities and commitment that these countries individually have in Africa, the openings are immense. But right now, they are doing it by their choice. If the BRICS African countries come together and offer them some package deal, that will make life easier like this, or your imports can be that much cheaper, etc., etc. My view is that Africa as a whole can benefit a lot, and you will see new memberships there.
But Ramesh, I still have a challenge in my mind. What can BRICS do more than what the 2 big players, India and China, are not currently doing already?
Okay.
What more can they do? Because these 2 are boots and all climbing into Africa. Not only them, as I've mentioned, you have the UAE, you have Russia. There's already an active outreach from BRICS members. And let's face it, we've said early on, they're not a trading body. You have the benefit of the New Development Bank. And I think that's where the biggest benefit probably lies in financing the gap for infrastructure, which if they can get it in place, would facilitate trade within Africa. So I see that as the major a contribution from a BRICS on a group basis, rather than sitting with a entity that's now going to do more as a group than what its members on a bilateral basis are doing. I don't see that happening. As a matter of fact, you're sitting with BRICS members that are going to draw from BRICS itself. Egypt is not in BRICS because of anything that they can give. They're what they can gain from it. The same goes for Iran. The same goes for Argentina. And so they're going to be they're going to be magnets. They're going to be pools. They're going to be drawing on the potential that BRICS as a grouping can provide. And it doesn't provide currently on a group basis. It is still on a bilateral basis. Probably facilitate that process, but not as for example, an EU giving or as an ASEAN giving. It's not going to happen.
So you may be right about that. My view is that as let's call it second tier members in Africa, many of them having somewhat similar requirements, if they now make life easier for the larger BRIC members with whom now they have better access because they're all sitting around one table at least twice a year, I think the conversation can be slightly different. Wherein, for example, Brazil's footprint in Africa is limited. What Brazil has done for itself in terms of food production, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of manufacturing is a story in itself. There's a lot that can be learned and got into Africa. So the trick is for our African brethren to make that sales pitch to Brazil as to what the opportunity is. Brazil has been lurking. It's a little bit in Angola, a little bit in Mozambique, but otherwise it's got no footprint here. India, on the other hand, so my view difference with you, Johan, is about the fact that the Indian footprint in Africa is more individualistic than governmental. The governmental apparatus that China has operated in Africa and therefore got itself some significant deals is completely different from the Indian model. The Indian private sector and Indian private individuals have come to Africa. I am saying that the government of India can now have the capacity and appetite to come to Africa and represent itself and bring with it 50, 60 top MNCs that India breeds. One example for you. I was in conversation recently with Fred Swanika. You all know him. Fred was telling me how he's in conversation with significant Indian software companies for them to shift their software developmental base into Africa, because he's able to produce the graduates who can actually do the work that a lot of Indians are doing now. In any case, in that industry, where the people sit doesn't matter. So his point being that I can provide that platform here in Africa, provide employment to Africans, and service the Indian need. So now India, which used to be the MBO of the world, is now being offered that out of Africa, right? I believe that there will be advantages if the Indians negotiate these kind of things well.
Yeah, but you have one challenge that India has, and that if you look on a per capita GDP, per capita power purchasing on a PPP basis, India is something like 9,000. It is at the lower end.
Yeah.
Will India's government not pick up a lot of flack from its people saying you are now investing at government level in Africa money that could be used for us? And is that not why India is keeping back at a government level, but allowing its private sector to move into Africa? Because if I was Indian and my government was spending money in Africa and I'm suffering at home, and make no mistake, there are a lot of people in India that are suffering, they would not be all that keen.
That is one part of the truth, and you're right about that. The second part of the truth is the Indian government has more and more got out of business and stuck to policy making, unlike the Chinese. So the Indian government business apparatus is, for the last 20 years at least, dysfunctional and being dismantled. Therefore, the Indian government has no real business face. It has to come in here with the private sector. And then, like you said, the private sector takes it over from there.
Which is good, because government shouldn't be in business.
Correct.
My point of view. Right. Paul, over to you. Sorry, we sort of got carried away.
No, I guess, it's maybe at this stage, what we need to think about is also just the role of the UAE. The UAE, once again, is doing immense work in doing trade deals, especially with India, Ramesh. And I guess if you look at the geographic position, there's obviously key benefits. It's the subcontinent of Asia. We've got great access from a UAE point of view, and there is good products and services that can be bilaterally traded. But I also think that if you look at the UAE strategy, being this idea that it is a hub for logistics, it's a hub for trade. Again, coming back to those trade flows, it's going to be interesting how these two markets really benefit from bilateral trade, and then ultimately how they can roll up into the bigger Brics component. Do you see the UAE in the Middle East as a key catalyst? I mean, how do you find that relationship between India?
Can I start by addressing something slightly different but connected to what you're saying? By saying that there were a lot of effort over the last 10 years by branches of the sovereign fund of Saudi and UAE wanting to make inroads into Africa. One, for soft power. Two, for their own food security. Number three, because they obviously want to diversify their commitments from the city banks of the world. I must say that the effort was half-baked in the way it was made, and the results were significantly subpar. I'm quite close to two of them, and I know what progress they've made. In Africa, almost nothing. One part of the answer is because Africa does not offer those kind of deals. Number two is because these sovereign funds are not operators; they're just investors, and all of us know what kind of investment opportunities are available here. The family-held businesses do not want them. The other small businesses are far too small, so those deals have not happened. Okay. On the other hand, that money is available if somebody has a sensible proposal project to offer them. The difference also has been that the UAE has approached it very much like India, where their private sector has come in and done what they've done, and therefore I work very closely with the DP world, and I know the kind of energy and effort they're putting in to find opportunities where there are none. That is truly private sector work, good quality work. Saudi, on the other hand, is only talking to governments that they can control, manage, influence, and buy out. Very Western approach, very Chinese approach. So Sudan is one such country of their target. Ethiopia used to be a country of their target. Egypt, I think they did some work. Okay. But they are afraid to come down south so far. Okay. So the approaches are very different from each other. My view is that even with India, the approach, while it has been a government-to-government handshake, it is largely dependent on the energy that the private sector has shown. In Saudi, much less by Indians, but UAE has for long been a haven for Indian investors, this way and that way both.
Yeah, and
Johan?
you raise a very interesting point, is the political system, democratic versus potentially a more centralized, or how these political systems work with each other and how they decide to trade with each other becomes a key factor. And in Africa, we know that elections is also a big thing, especially when, like in South Africa, we've got the election in 2024. These things impact ultimately trade, but I guess it also impacts at a ground level the trade partnership, especially in terms of the political power. Johan, I mean, what's your view in terms of how these political elements pan out, especially in terms of political power and political systems?
Political systems, you know, before I went to Singapore, democracy was the thing. In Singapore, I learned it's not about how you vote, it's about what gets done. Singaporeans will tell you straight, democracy is overrated, highly overrated. Yes, they vote in Singapore. And every 4 or 5 years they vote. The same party has been in power since 1965. And what they have done is shown that it's about what they call miles per hour, meritocracy, pragmatic, honesty. So you need to do what you say and you set out yourself to do. In Africa, you're sitting with an entity called Afrobarometer, who regularly does surveys, and they show that an increasing number of South Africans, amongst others, are quite willing to let go of their democratic rights in favor of peace, no crime, security, with other words, economic well-being, and. We see that in the UAE. Things work. Yeah, I'm an expat. 9 million of us in a country of 10 million people. I don't worry about voting because things work. Infrastructure is great. Peace and security, any time of the night I can go out. The systems work. The infrastructure works. So I think we should not overemphasize the political system as being there's one political system and that's the way it works. Africa will tell you, in democracy, this is how Africa works. It's not the same as how it in the West works. And frankly, when we look at what's happening in the US, what's happening in the UK, a lot of Africans smile. I had to smile the time when some other African country actually put out a cautionary for its citizens in London saying, be careful, you know, that it's dangerous in that city. So one needs to be careful when you look at this kind of thing. The obvious negative is when you have a dictator that runs the country into the ground. But then you also have democratic countries where the ruling party is running the country into the ground. I don't need to mention samples, or example rather. So I'm open to being convinced as to there's some other political system that is the better one. The best political system is the one that gets things done and that doing its best for its people and has its best interest of the people and the country, you know, in the forefront of its mind when it takes decisions.
Yeah.
Paul, I have a point to make here.
Yeah.
Sorry. I live in a very small country, Rwanda. And in my view, I have spoken to enough Rwandese, not just the intelligentsia. I asked my driver, I asked the lady who manages the building downstairs. And they will all say unequivocally, they're all aware of where we started from 30 years back, even 20 years back. In fact, the lady told me even 12 years back, this was a different country. Simply the stamina and the diligence towards the vision that President Kagame has pressed with has resulted in this country being where it is. And in my own experience over the last 12 years that I've been coming here, 13, 15 years I've been coming here, it's only got better every time I've come. I now live here. Okay. All the Rwandese will give up their democratic rights for the fact that you need a guy like Kagame running this place.
Mm.
Okay. So like he talked about UAE and Singapore, I can promise you one more example of how people are happy with giving complete. One more last example is Republic of Benin is a neighboring country of Nigeria. It is the only country in Africa that I think can compete favorably with Kagame's Rwanda. It is run by Patrice Talon. Patrice Talon is a businessman. I've known Patrice for 30 years. But he's not here to make money. He's here to leave a legacy. The city of Cotonou that I've known for 30 years, in the last 25 was one shape. 2 street, 4 restaurants kind of a place. Nice place, but very quiet, very low-key, very dependent on the Nigerian economy. In the last 5 years, 7 years actually, transformed. It's an unrecognizable, it could be a B-class European city today. Pavement, security, everything else. Security was always not a challenge, and the quality of people who run that place. If you ask any Beninois today, can we leave this country safely in Talon's hand till he dies? They will all say yes.
Yeah, and I think also it comes down to leadership, right? So political leadership, especially in these countries. Yeah. I think what you're accentuating is the fact that it's whatever political system is in place, ultimately what dictates that growth and what gets done is ultimately the leadership. And we all have been fortunate to be part of different countries and markets where there is strong leadership, where there is a bias to getting things done and unlocking value. When that happens, there's something that is quite special about those countries. And then, like Johan said, we've seen the contrast as well. So, when it comes to Brics, once again, if you look at the co-opetition of a lot of these countries, there's also a key component that we're currently sitting with an aggressor in the form of Russia, and their ideology and their ambition in terms of what they want to achieve. So maybe Ramesh, what's your view on how these other economies collaborate, coordinate, and work with a Russian economy, which is really perceived as a key aggressor in today's construct?
Okay, so my thought on that, and we have had a separate discussion on that a few days back, was that if you go to the forget the BRICS. Let's go to African countries. African countries, especially the second tier African countries, and there are plenty of them, will align with Russia any day for free money. Okay, so that is one side of the story. The Brazil, the India, and the China will all have their separate equations with Russia, and I think China and India will align with Russia more to tell the rest of the world and leave a message that we will do what we want and we will only serve our own interest. Screw you. Okay. Brazil may not want to take that chance yet. They'll rather be neutral, lukewarm to Russia, lukewarm to everybody else in the world and get the best of what they can get because the stage of evolution they are at. Okay. That's my view. Will the Western world want to hold BRICS as one association where Russia is involved to account for what Russia is doing? I think they don't have the capability for that anymore. Those days are long gone. But can they use India, maybe even China, to talk to Russia because Russia is not talking to them, right? That is a likelihood. And I think India and China should use that key to their advantage as being the people who have an open access to Russia and therefore can be seen as messengers to and from Russia?
I think the other big factor is what are the existing trade partnerships and trade flows between Russia and other BRIC countries, especially with the BRICS expansion. So there are unique countries there. I'm just thinking, if you look at OPEC plus and some of these OPEC countries, the main trade, especially from a Russian perspective, is energy. And besides energy, it's food. So it's going to be interesting again how they cooperate in that sense, especially with the backdrop and context of the world in the moment. I mean, Johan, is there any other insights that you would believe that's quite important with the Russia backdrop?
Well, if you look at the trade between Russia and the G7 since 2014, it's fallen by more than 36% because of sanctions. On the other hand, trade between Russia and the other BRICS nations have increased in the same period. This is since 2014, nearly, it was now 9 years, by more than 121% over the same period. China and India have become the largest importers of Russian oil, whereas China's trade with Russia hit a record of $188.5 billion last year, which is a 97% increase from 2014 and around 30% larger than 2021. This happened as Russia more than doubled its rail exports of liquefied petroleum gas as part of its drive to diversify its exports because of the sanctions against it. So what we're seeing there is clearly Russia finding alternatives. It has targeted Africa precisely because of earlier sanctions against it, because of its invasion of the Crimean Peninsula. It is increasing that drive currently, to the extent that you have countries like South Africa preferring not to take in a stance against Russia, not supporting UN resolutions against Russia. So it has managed to move away, and with BRICS now, it's gaining impetus in its move away from Europe, G7 centered, or even G20 to that extent, centered trade and economic relations, looking at the global south. And because of the US's weaponization of the dollar, it's gaining sympathy, it being Russia gaining sympathy from the global south and getting support from them. If not economic, then definitely political. BRICS has become a bomb for Russia, as the one guy said.
So, gentlemen, I guess in closing, the big other discussion point is what's next for BRICS. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. We spoke about some of the key benefits and also some of the key trade-offs and challenges that are on the horizon. We are fresh from the latest summit. What is next? What is a win for BRICS? Because, once again, you've got a lot of good momentum. You've also have some detractors. But what does a win look like for BRICS?
The road ahead? I put down a few factors because I thought you were going to ask me that. First of all, the growth of BRICS has now just had a phase 1. There's going to be a phase 2 and a phase 3. You need to look at, for example, Turkey. You need to look at Mexico. You need to look at Indonesia. Indonesia apparently was going to be, they agreed, we will bring you on board. And then the president said, okay, we have a problem. We have a few things that we need to look at. And literally at the very last stage, they withdrew, or did not accept the invitation. Secondly, BRICS needs to look at developing into a trade bloc or a free trade area where trade and investment facilitation will take place in the form of a bloc. It's currently not the case. Thirdly, you need to do that, institutionalize BRICS, formalizing the arrangements and the rules of engagement, etc. We're going to see more of de-dollarization. We did not really speak of this in much depth. having a single BRICS currency is not going to happen in my lifetime. Even the people that suggested it at first, Brazil, afterwards said, yes, they're looking at a trade currency or trading in rather non-dollar terms, like the African continental free trade area is looking at its Pan-African payment and settlement system, where in Ghana, I buy and pay in Ghanaian currency, and in Kenya, I receive in Kenyan currency. So that we're going to see more of, reducing the role, the importance of dollars is going to be slow. They still need to look at, for example, how do they prevent Russia sitting with, when there's an imbalance in trade, with too many rupees than it can deal with. Thirdly, or fifthly, rather, in this case, African continental free trade area, there needs to, and there will be a greater collaboration. You're sitting still with the billion people that are not involved in BRICS, and we're going to see more of that. Also, you're going to see, given the member states of BRICS, their respective memberships of other trade entities and political entities, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and you're going to see greater influence in that from BRICS perspective, reaching out as their members. And they need to look at conflict resolution to address the things that we've mentioned, between China and India, between Iran on the one hand, the UAE and Saudi on the other hand, Egypt and Ethiopia also at loggerheads with one another. So they would need to look at some form of conflict resolution mechanism within BRICS.
Ramesh, final thoughts?
I think Johan has given a rather comprehensive, complete answer. I just one thing to add to this. I would have started by saying that strengthening institutions within BRICS to make it a proper entity and not just a bunch of friends sitting around is the way ahead. My view is that as a start, if the intra-member local currency trade can start, it will already encourage conversations which will, I think, be useful. And I completely agree with Johan that in our lifetime, the BRICS single currency is not going to happen. Okay, there are too many large powers at stake over there. That will not happen. But at least start with this. Increased membership is obviously the logical way ahead. And yes, I had heard the story of Indonesia declining the invitation. Otherwise, that would have been a very powerful addition. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that sort of covers what I had in mind.
Yeah, the two key points there is, as Johan said, is conflict resolution. We're trying to resolve the conflict. And then on the currency side of things, that is almost like, for me, a non-factor, because, I mean, once again, if you look at reserve currency at the moment, the amount of dollars in the system, it's still 50% of currency reserve in the globe. How do you get a single currency that's convertible, that can lubricate the market at this global stage, and that these economies can trust? I guess you've seen recently Russia and China trading in yuan, and what that meant for Russia. It seems like there's a bit of struggles. So it's going to be interesting how a single currency ultimately evolves and how that conversation evolves.
Yeah, it's going to require a central bank.
Correct. And
that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, the dollars is more than 50%. I think you're underestimating the impact. We're looking at the 60s plus. But your point remains extremely valid. Despite the search for a non-dollar denominated entity, currency rather, it's not going to happen quickly.
Yeah. So, gentlemen, on that note, a big thank you, Johan. A big thank you, Ramesh. It was fantastic. We really covered a lot of ground, and I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, Paul. Thank you, Johan, for all the enlightenment.
Also, thank you for your input, Ramesh. Always, Ramesh and I go back quite a while,
Yes.
And I'm a big fan of his intellect and his insights. So whenever I have the opportunity to join him in, I do that gladly and eagerly.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you for having us. This has been very enlightening for me as well in the preparation of this. It's been super.
Correct.